Hello, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Very happy to be here with you this morning. Thank you particularly to Duff for the opportunity to talk with you about the specification for using PDF to package and represent email, which is a project that I became involved with, about a year and a half or so now. I'd like to actually start things off this morning with a little bit of a poll, which I'll ask Duff to send through at the moment. And the question is very, very simple. Have you ever printed or saved an email as a PDF document? So if you could go ahead and fill that out, I'd appreciate it. While you're doing that, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background. The project that I'll be describing to you and the specification that I'll be describing to you this morning is work that has been funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The Mellon Foundation funds a variety of projects in the cultural heritage sector. In particular, has an interest in technologies and in projects that push forward a deeper understanding of history, of literature, of all kinds of humanities fields. And it's a project that the Mellon Foundation has funded, building on some additional work, some earlier work that I'll describe. And it's a project that's centered here at the University of Illinois, which is my own home institution. So thank you for filling that poll out. I'm not surprised to note that actually most of you have printed emails to PDF. Duff shared with me the other day some work that the PDF Association put out recently about the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's so-called email. So the use of PDF to represent email is a technology that's very, very widely known about and used, so it doesn't surprise me, and I'm happy to see actually that many of you have printed email to PDF, because that's what this project really is all about. Before we get too far into things here, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about myself, because this is the first time that I'm engaging with the PDF Association formally and with the PDF community. So just so you know, if we're meeting in person, I'd be really glad to be meeting each and every one of you, shaking your hands or doing an elbow bump or whatever we might. But since we can't do that, I thought just a little bit of background about myself and the perspective I'm bringing to this project. I actually was trained as a historian, had planned to teach as a historian and to be a historian in a college or university somewhere. And here you see myself and my wife back in 1997, just north of, or actually south of Whitby, in England, when I was doing my doctoral research. And one of the things I found at that time was that one of the most uniquely valuable pieces of evidence for me as a historian was correspondence, and the value that correspondence and individual messages to one another, to individuals, as well as official correspondence played in my dissertation. I took a little bit of a side route after that, and in 2001 became an archivist working here at the University of Illinois. And here you see me working with, the raw materials of history with a collection that we acquired. I actually worked for about 20 years or so in that role, and as part of that, became increasingly involved in a number of technology projects. So if I was an accidental archivist, I also became an accidental technologist, an accidental digital preservation student. Back in 2009 and 10, I actually had a wonderful opportunity to take a sabbatical, which is one of the perks of being a faculty member here at the university, and was fortunate enough to work at the University of Dundee and have a home in Brodie Ferry, Scotland, which is where this picture is actually taken from, believe it or not, on Christmas Eve back in 2009. And as part, the long and the short of that project was I went into it working to make and trying to make digital preservation technologies more accessible to our community. Many of the digital preservation technologies that we were interfacing with at the time were very, very complex. And I had this somewhat naive notion, actually, that I could kind of boil everything down to something simple, something easy for an individual to implement. Now, at the end of that, I actually came to the somewhat opposite conclusion, which is that digital preservation takes a village and that an entire community of people is really necessary to help my community of archivists and librarians preserve digital objects. So really today, in my role as Associate Dean for Digital Strategies here at the University of Illinois, the entire focus of my work is on community building, which is why I'm very happy to speak with all of you today, because you know, a lot of us like to build communities within our own sort of bailiwick or in our own area, which for me is libraries and archives. But over time have come increasingly to recognize and value the importance of partnerships with many other communities. And I'm really, really happy to be engaging with all of you in the PDF community today. All of that said, I'd like to tell you a little bit as well about the archives, records management, and digital preservation community that I am representing and that I'm part of. The main organization that I belong to here in the United States is the Society of American Archivists. This is a group of about 6,000 individuals who belong to our professional association and who have a strong interest in preserving digital heritage for future generations. In addition to that, we have a records management community represented here in the United States by ARMA. I forget exactly what ARMA stands for originally, but now it is essentially representing the records management community and has quite a bit of representation in industry and government and so forth. I've also worked extensively with the digital preservation community and the Digital Preservation Coalition in the United Kingdom, which has sponsored some of our works, as well as the Council on Library and Information Resources. All of these organizations and many others have a strong interest in using technologies to preserve email, correspondence, and other types of records as well, and is essentially the community that I'm representing in this work to develop a draft specification to package and represent email. What I'd like to do now is just describe to you what some of the overall email archiving challenges are that our community faces. As you can imagine, a lot of these are around some simple, but also in some ways rather hard to represent question, which is basically what should we capture for short-term preservation, potentially for long-term preservation. Many archives in the country here in the United States, as well as around the world, have been capturing email messages from either business processes, from leaders in their organization, or from private individuals. I was on a webinar, actually a workshop last week with people representing many types of archives, including business, including private collecting organizations, and all of them have an interest in capturing and preserving these correspondences between individuals. Now, there are a lot of concerns about what to capture. How do you ensure that private documents or that sensitive content is not included? How do you capture attachments? How do you capture linked content, such as things that might be at a URL that are included? And all of those are issues that can be addressed in a variety of factors, but PDF is a particularly compelling technology to look at for capturing and essentially fixing those email messages at a point in time. Another question is how to preserve email once it's been captured. What is the best preservation and access format? I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute, but also how will metadata about messages be captured and represented? If you have an opportunity to read the Hunter Biden email blog post from the other day about on the PDF Association website, you'll see that the message that was captured or represented there basically contains no metadata that would allow you to verify the authenticity of the message. And then again, what's the most appropriate container format for email? Should it be EML? Should it be Mbox? Should it be some other XML-based standard? There's one that my community has developed, which basically has very little support within the vendor community. And then additionally, how to develop workflows that meet archivists' need. Right now, if you want to preserve and capture that is and preserve an email, you go through typically a long set of complex tool chaining operations that result in the capture, processing, arrangement, description, and eventually preservation of a message, which relies rather heavily on a variety of community-specific tools that have been developed, all of which are very valuable, all of which are very useful, but all of which also have a somewhat tenuous support mechanisms and relatively small user base in the community. Just like to mention here, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the need for email preservation solutions within my community, the Digital Preservation Coalition has a report which I have written and published based on extensive feedback, laying out some recommendations for people in my community, as well as private individuals who might wish to capture and preserve email messages. And it's a little bit of reading here. I'll just refer it to you. The main takeaway from it is that it really advocates very strongly that appropriate technical standards, capture methods, and processing tools be developed either in the digital preservation community or in concert with other communities such as the PDF Association, so that archivists at any size institution, from the largest research libraries such as the one I belong to down to the smallest archives, in a community somewhere, can capture and preserve email just like they would capture and preserve a print document and put it into a folder somewhere for its legal value, for its administrative value, or for its historical value. The work in the specification itself really is an outcome from another report which the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation sponsored and which the Digital Preservation Coalitions also supported, called The Future of Email Archives. This report lays out a framework for additional follow-on work, some of which has been funded by the foundation, including this work to develop this draft specification. So if you look at the report, you'll see that it's based on, and really the outcome of, a community of individuals that's drawn from not only the digital preservation sector, people like Kevin DeVorsey at the National Archives and Records Administration, Kate Murray at the Library of Congress, my colleague Camille Tyndall Watson or Tricia Patterson at Harvard University, but also from those who have a deep knowledge of the PDF ecosystem as well as standards, people like Duff, Steve Levinson, and Matthew Hardy. So the work itself is already a collaboration with many of you in the PDF Association. And it's important to note that. I'd like to give a particular shout out here to Joel Simpson from Artifactual Systems, which is a vendor in the cultural heritage sector, which develops preservation tools, and who acted as a consultant on the project and did the majority of the wrangling and work that led to the specification document itself, which I'll introduce in a minute. So looking at the Future of Email Archiving report, it lists out a series of what the report calls high impact recommendations for my community. And I've highlighted 4 of those recommendations that are particularly applicable to this project: improving options for PDF and email archiving, developing and sustaining tool workflows, as well as interoperability and developing email archiving tools. All of this is to say is that the project that I'm representing to you here has a deep root within the community and is something that our community is very interested in bringing forward for collaboration with all of you in the PDF Association and in the organizations that you represent. The report itself is currently available in draft form. The URL is at the bottom of the page here in the little yellow box, and I'd encourage you to check the report out. We are looking at publishing it potentially with the Council on Library and Information Resources, and I'm in consultations with that group right now, and it probably will come out in a little bit more formatted and polished format in the next month or so. But I'd like to just take a step back and articulate the purpose for the specification, which essentially is threefold. First, articulating the rationale for transforming email messages into PDF. That is a message partly to my own community, which has not extensively used PDF as a preservation format to date, but to which I think there is a strong rationale and reason to do so. The second is really to lay out some high-level conceptual requirements for how you would package one or more messages into an email archive using PDF or eAPDF format. Really leveraging the built-in functionality of the PDF format as a container format with its ability to handle and use structured data from one message or from many messages in a hierarchical fashion, and really preserving those archival attributes that we're most interested. And then in a third purpose here is to describe the functional requirements for a potential eAPDF specific viewer. The format recommendations themselves that we lay out provide for viewing of eAPDF in legacy viewers and viewers that already exist, as well as recommending the potential of building out of eAPDF specific viewers, which would leverage the structured nature of the package profile and format that we're recommending. So the big question, and sort of the elephant in the room, if you will, for my own community, is why convert email to PDF in the first place? There's, essentially, why do it? Aren't there already good preservation pathways out there for it? A couple of ways to answer that question. One of the simplest is simply that people in my community want to do it and in fact need to do it. As I mentioned last week, I was teaching a one-day workshop on email preservation with my colleague Tricia Patterson, who's a digital preservation analyst at Harvard University Libraries. And when we mentioned this email to PDF project during our presentation, along with a variety of other options, several members popped up in chat without us soliciting any comment from them to say, really, I'm excited about this work. It would meet the needs that we have because it's potentially a very simple to implement and also simple to explain and simple to provide format for our users. So you can see some of the quotes here from individuals. In addition to that, I would just point out that in the community right now, there are a wide variety of tools that people can pick from and need to pick from to do email preservation work. I'm not going to step through each of these here, but these are just a variety of the tools that are in our community and can potentially be used. What that means in very practical terms is that if somebody wants to preserve email as an archivist or a records manager, there are some relatively complex workflow scenarios that individual or organization needs to go through. This represents one, as you can see, using multiple tools here to capture mbox files, to image hard drives, to convert to PST folders, to feed those into an email processing tool, then put it through an appraisal process, generate some working files, and eventually end up with preservable objects in mbox format and discovery pathways through other software. The bottom line is this is a very complex workflow, and while it's scalable for institutions such as Stanford University, which uses this, it may not be as scalable for somebody in other types of contexts. So then the question is, why do we need another standard for email? A part of the answer to this question is simply that the core email standards that we're working with right now, such as mbox and EML, which are formalized in a series of RFCs from the Internet Engineering Task Force, really are intended to tell the implementer how to send and receive emails. They're not intended to tell people how to store or capture them for later use. As a result, most of the email systems that are out there use their own internal database formats to capture and preserve email, whether that's in PST format such as Microsoft Exchange, or whether it's in some other format. So PST, Mbox, all of those are really an export that's taken at a particular point in time. We think in particular, and I was convinced as I was working with Duff, with Matthew, and with others in the PDF community, that they can be improved on by by standardizing the way in which metadata is captured and standardizing a packaging model into which email message and email content is put at the time of capture, while also making the distributable package much more readily accessible and usable. So that right now, instead of preserving and distributing a large Mbox file to somebody and requiring that they load it into an email client to view it, you could instead distribute a PDF format, which is much more universally accessible. All of this is to say things that most of you already know. PDF has a large existing market. While the current PDF tools wouldn't display the entirety of all of the hierarchical packaging and structure of an email account in one file, you can build tools and build a viewer that does that. But there is a legacy reader there for everybody on almost any device universally that would allow them to package or to show a PDF file or an email message that's been packaged in PDF format. Of course, the PDF Association also represents a strong part of that ecosystem, and all of you do as well. And for me as an archivist, the ability to tap into the standards development process that the PDF Association represents is really a huge plus. PDF 2.0, of course, is also a technology that's essentially fit to the requirements that we have and fit to purpose because it provides strong support for technically complex metadata, associated content such as attachments that might be included, and again, the structured nature of email of folders and accounts. All of that said, I'd like to just provide a brief overview of the technical or the functional specifications themselves. It's not a complete spec at this point. It really offers an overview of what a fully fleshed out reference model and fully fleshed out specification would provide, excuse me, in 5 specific areas. First, there's an emphasis that the EAPDF file should and must in fact use open standards, that anything that's represented in EAPDF should be a superset of functionality that leverages the already supported and already standardized elements of the PDF 2.0 format. In addition, an EAPDF file should conform to the ISO PDF-A and PDF UA2A format requirements, so that to the greatest extent possible, EAPDF files are archival, as well as, in addition to that, universally accessible. And again, leveraging the structured metadata support that PDF 2.0 provides as well, which is a very attractive feature for me as an archivist, because it allows a way to take the header information from an email message and present it in a structured and a way that has downstream use for viewers as well as for search and so on, and filtering and so on and so forth. Secondly, the functional specs lay out particular ways in which email messages should be captured. It specifies that anything from a single message to all of the messages in a folder or account might be captured into a PDF file or set of files, specifies that header metadata should be written into appropriate XMP metadata, specifies the particular elements of header metadata that should be or might be written into the visible portions of the file, ways in which body parts should be represented, recommends that attachments be captured by default, and that the tooling that's developed should support options to either include or exclude particular elements of the message based on policy. For instance, supporting the redaction of certain parts of the messages or certain header fields if those are deemed irrelevant for a particular use case. The standard also recommends some options for capturing linked content, that is spidering out to a website that might be referenced in a message, or a Google Drive document, a box file, a Microsoft Word document, or what have you. Again, those are optional elements. They're not requirements, but something that would be of great value to the community, because as an archivist and as a historian, I know when you're looking through that folder of correspondence and there's a reference document that's missing, that can sometimes be the piece of content that's the most important to you. The standard also makes some recommendations around how EA PDF packages should be described. Specifically, any exclusions that are, any content that's excluded should be documented. The package itself should be described as a whole. The provenance of the email to PDF production process tracked and represented in the file. This is something that's painfully missing from the supposed email that was represented from Hunter Biden's account, if that's in fact what it was, which there's many questions about. And finally, the package itself should be signed by the creating agent, the software and human user who created the package. Those will preserve those types of provenance and types of metadata that allow archivist, a lawyer, a judge, whoever, to judge the package authenticity. And then finally, the email package should be represented in a certain way. As I've indicated already, the standard mandates that EA PDF files will be viewable in legacy PDF readers and any PDF software that currently displays PDF 2.0 compliant files. In addition to that, it lays out a core representation for an EA PDF file, defines what it should look like, and then specifies ways in which it might be allow for enhanced viewing in an EA PDF viewer, which is a prospective piece of software that might be provided in the future. Okay, so just to show you here, here's an example of a current PDF file, which I actually produced from my own email account. As you can see, it provides limited header information. The package provenance is really unknown. We just know that this was printed at some point. The attachments are not included. The link here is not harvested and included in the PDF file. And this work is really intended to rectify problems such as that. Where it aims long-term potentially is toward software that might be as simple as creating an EA PDF file when you click the print button in your email client of choice, or it might be a separate set of tools through other software packages that allow for the bulk creation of email messages. That's sort of the long game. That's where we're hoping to head over the upcoming years, months and years of development. In terms of what's next, essentially, we're looking toward a proof of concept. We would like to draft the formal specification and formal format specification based on the functional spec, which we've laid out in the document that I've referenced, and then build a proof of concept, a minimum viable product, Mbox to EA PDF creator, essentially a command line style tool that would create an EA PDF from a single email messages, a folder of messages, a message thread, and potentially an entire account or inbox. What this would entail is an independent implementer who would also use that format specification and then based on the produced file from the EA PDF parser, implement a round trip conversion to write that file back to an EML or MBOX file. What this really would require, and what I'm hoping piques some of your interest, are partnerships in the PDF Association and membership. You'll note that at this time we're not anticipating ISO standardization, but really seeing that as potentially a step down the road. In the short term, I've submitted a potential a grant application to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, that is IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, to kick off this work, and I'm currently waiting to hear back from that. So at this time, I'd like to open things up for questions and discussion. Again, I'm very happy to give you an overview of this work and to hear all of your thoughts about it, because it's an exciting opportunity for me in the digital preservation community, I think, and hopefully for all of you as well in the PDF community as well. So again, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so well, we'd definitely like to start taking your questions for Chris. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel here. So Chris, the first question here from the attendees: does EAPDF support redactions?
Yes, it's intended to support redactions. That is a need that we've already noted in the email archiving community. Some of the other tools that are out there support it in a very limited sense, but yes, we recognize that there are certainly areas where there's a strong use case for redactions.
We could even, I think, Chris, go so far as to say that the ability to support redactions is one of the arguments for EAPDF.
It is, because it's very difficult to redact content in the other formats that are used right now for preservation or access of email. In practical terms, what many institutions have been doing is exporting MBOX files or PST, and neither of those support redactions. Essentially, you end up removing the content entirely from the message, which then requires that you have both two separate versions of the file, one that's redacted and one that's not, which is, kind of a flaky way to approach it.
Great. Next question. Are you at the point where you have any example documents that demonstrate the sort of archived emails you're hoping to produce, for example, showing the metadata?
No, we're not. That's actually a good question. Without being somebody that's embedded deeply within the community, within the PDF community, I'm not quite sure how I'd go about producing one of those right now. But yeah, I think it would be a nice step to have essentially a target reference sample email out there.
That's sort of what you're looking at for your next phase, I guess.
It is. I mean, I think the best way to do it would be to have this command line tool where we take an MBOX file or a connection via IMAP to a server and spit out an email message, essentially by mapping the elements of the message over to PDF and then parsing them into the appropriate structure, EAPDF structure. It's really the next step.
What about corporate email archiving solutions? Would they be interested in EAPDF?
I think they would actually be quite interested in it. The corporate email archiving market is both different from and similar to the market that exists in government and in academia. Essentially, in the corporate sector, from my understanding, there are a lot of email archiving solutions which essentially are there for records compliance and records management purposes, essentially capturing traffic as it happens, sitting as a man in the middle there between the sending and the receiving server to capture things. So there's a potential market there for capturing to PDF at that point in time, because from that point you could apply retention rules to particular messages that are kept or not kept over time. Some messages need to be kept permanently for business purposes, and some don't. So I do think there's a market there as well. I would say there's a very, very strong market in the government community in particular, because many government agencies right now here in the United States, and I assume in other countries as well, use PDF as a target preservation format for other document types, including reports, including publications and so forth. And PDF is something they're very familiar with and use for those formats, and also have a strong demand for email messages as well. If you look at some of your major government agencies here in the US, they have an approach of preserving email from most of the agency leaders or director level type positions, based on the assumption that those have historical value and have long-term administrative value to the agency.